Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, man, oh man, chapter 1044 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so, because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. What a freaking time to be alive. This was absolutely, for me, it was absolutely shocking. Creative in a way that I did not anticipate, and I loved so much. But there's definitely layers to what's occurred here, and I think that you'll see that from some of the discourse that surrounds it. I mean, this has the potential to be a very divisive chapter, just quite honestly. So I feel like what I want to do with this review is explain why I loved it, explain what about it I think is special, but also this is probably an important chapter in which to highlight sort of the critiques of this, the small ways in which it may be a problem for some people, and I want to make sure that these things aren't confused. Basically, I feel like this is a chapter more than others in which every voice needs to be heard and understood, because this feels like a chapter that we're going to be talking about until the end of One Piece, and maybe after. So if you guys don't want to look under the hood, I suggest that you click off the video now before you get mad at me. And now that that's done, let's do it. I think most people who follow the channel know by now that I idolize Brandon Sanderson, fantasy author, just incredible work rate. I love all of his stories, and he posts lectures from his classes online, and I have watched them all. And one thing that he said really stands out to me as being memorable and worthy of teaching. The number one priority you should have if you are trying to create a story, this applies to you as much as it applies to Hollywood directors, writers, or Oda himself. The number one priority always is to make your story awesome. In terms of all story, but in this case manga, create visually memorable moments. As Brandon says in his lectures, when he is writing his story, he tries to come up with scenes that he believes are really freaking awesome, and then he writes towards them, justifying them in the best way that he can. But at the end of the day, these awesome moments are really driving the plot. They are dictating the story. Why is this thing happening? Well, because we're going to what Brandon or other authors think is an awesome moment. Because without the awesome moments, right, nobody cares. I've talked about Harry Potter a lot, and I think Harry Potter really embodies this, at least as far as things that I've read, more than anything else. Like think about all the wacky things that happen in Harry Potter. All of a sudden, right, they're driving in a flying car to school and then run into a tree that attacks them. Why is this happening? Because it's an awesome freaking moment. I believe it is one of those that is incredibly memorable from Harry Potter, and Harry Potter has a lot of these very memorable moments. It is full of awesome, and that was why it was so absurdly popular. But I think that logically, you have to realize that to reach awesome, crazy, zany moments, oftentimes other things have to be taken or sacrificed, like, for instance, realism. In most cases, the realistic thing to occur is probably the most mundane thing and the least interesting. That's why it also helps to have interesting characters who are capable of making interesting decisions. You introduce a flying car that a parental figure has basically stolen and illegally modified, even though he is a member of the government. They then decide to drive this modified vehicle to school, or I should say to the train, for plot reasons. Then it just so happens that Harry and Ron are the very last two to go through the platform, so the people that they came with, everyone else is already on the train, but Harry and Ron are not, which is kind of convenient. They then have this absurd thought that if they miss the train, they won't be able to get to school, nor do they wait for said parental figures to return to talk about what they should do, as if getting on the train is the only way it's possible to get to Hogwarts. They then decide that it is a good idea to steal the modified flying car and fly to Hogwarts by following the train, and the car just happens to last long enough for them to reach their destination and run into an interesting tree. Why? Because we need the car to escape without being captured, because it's going to be a very convenient excuse later when it is discovered that the car is actually partly sentient, which is not really ever fully explained. I want to make this very clear. I love this scene from Harry Potter, and I'm not here to rag on that series because it's my childhood favorite, no joke. But it is also true that you can pretty much do similar nitpicking to what I just did for a lot of the things that happened in Harry Potter. And so, to get back to the heart of the matter here, why am I able to do this? Well, because awesome it usually requires sacrifice. You have to jump through hoops to make these events occur, because the most creative, interesting thing is not always the most realistic. You have to retroactively find the best excuses you can possibly come up with to justify them. And the further you push, the more likely it is that the excuses won't hold up, at least to the eye of a critic. And a part of the onus is usually on the reader to want to believe. You have to want to believe. Like, we're just looking for things that we haven't seen before, but that appeal in a way that we are familiar with. And the reason that we haven't seen these things before is because there's circumstances that are hard to recreate. Anyway, I think that the line that people subconsciously draw in the sand, I don't think that it's usually very conscious, but the line in the sand is whether or not you find the event or the moment, the scene, awesome. Because if you find it awesome, you can be very forgiving of jumping through hurdles to want to believe in it. Those little inconsistencies simply matter less, and it's easier to overcome them. But if you don't, I think that it can get very tedious. And then the bias switches, where you begin to argue why the thing doesn't make sense. And that's why it doesn't work for you. But at the end of the day, it's really just about the thing itself. Is it awesome? That is the difference. You either feel it or you don't. It's the point at which taste merges with criticism. So enough rambling, let's talk specifically about One Piece. What exactly am I talking about? Well, I alluded to this in previous chapter reactions, but no matter what argument that I make, or what argument Oda makes, right, there will be people who this moment will forever disappoint them, because it leaves lingering questions that you can only overcome if you want to. And it's also a moment where I feel like Oda is putting his foot in the ground and saying, no, this is what One Piece is. The powers that Luffy has unlocked here and the way that they are described, it sets the tone. Or maybe better phrasing here is it reestablishes the tone in a way that is pretty irrevocable. But focusing here more generally about the consistency of the story. Essentially, if Luffy has the strongest fruit, a fruit that is considered to be the strongest in the world, we should know by now. Or even if we don't know, it should be a thought that is so strongly justified that when the reveal happens, it is like, duh. Period, end of story. If the world government has been trying and failing to obtain the Gomu Gomu no Mi for 800 years, if it is a fruit of this level of significance, they've known who's possessed the fruit for the entirety of the story. And if they didn't know that Luffy had the Gomu Gomu no Mi and that this is what the fruit could become, then good lord. And for a very significant amount of time, Luffy has been vulnerable. So basically what I'm saying is that they needed to have done more in order to try and capture him. Have they done things? For sure, but did they do enough given the threat that Luffy provides? That, no matter what I will say, will remain a debatable point. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to know, right? There can be many people that can be surprised. Oh, Gomu Gomu no Mi, oh, less than fruit, right? So you encounter someone and they underestimate Luffy, that makes sense. But from the Gorosei standpoint and the actions that they've chosen to do, it doesn't work as well. Starting now. And then applied retroactively to the rest of the story. I almost think, like, logically speaking, the story really only works if Luffy is dismissed. Like, essentially ignored, overlooked, underestimated. And that only really works when Luffy doesn't have the world's most powerful fruit from the very beginning. And I think that that's probably been my mindset for the entire story. I mean, it took a while, right? Luffy eventually did enough things so that we arrive in the New World. It's like, okay, alright, Luffy needs to now watch his back because they're gunning for him. Starting with the New World, it's like Luffy has to be strong enough to withstand anything, to fight anyone. He's on the map. And so yes, he's provided some time to grow in the New World, but that works because the New World is a very dangerous place, controlled mostly by pirates and Yonko with very limited government control. So Luffy can go from all these islands, grow a little bit to reach this point, and it works. But unfortunately, you have to jump through hoops to believe in this in paradise. You've got to want to believe. It is very obvious that the world government didn't devote all of their attention or their efforts into obtaining this fruit or capturing Luffy, despite really at this point every reason to do so. That isn't to say that Oda hasn't built in excuses that you can buy or not, but it's really you have to choose. Like for instance, well, we're kind of dismissing the fruit because it hasn't awakened in so long. The fruit's really only powerful if it's awakened, but it's not going to awaken, therefore it doesn't matter who has the fruit. I consider this to be a weak excuse, just purely realistically and logically. From at least Alabasta, the world government had enough reason to send all of the admirals against the Straw Hats, if they wanted to. I mean, they understand how the Grand Line works, they understand the paths. There's no doubt in my mind that if they really wanted to, they could have intercepted the Straw Hats, and we know, based on power levels, that there would be essentially no chance that the Straw Hats would be able to do anything. You just lose into the story then and there. For instance, the moment that comes to mind is in Water 7, CP9 defeated Straw Hat Luffy and the Straw Hats. CP9 we see, and Cypherpole in general, is always communicating with their higher ups through Dinamushi or other means. At this moment, again, just purely logically, right, Lucci receives an order from the Gorosei to capture Straw Hat Luffy, because he is a person already at this point that cannot be dismissed. Or after this, when they know that Straw Hat Luffy has invaded Enies Lobby trying to rescue Robin, they don't send an admiral. Before you could say, well, the admirals probably have something more important to do, but now you gotta want to believe. Or as the Straw Hats return back to Water 7, finally it seems like the world government has sent somebody very strong, but you send Luffy's grandpa, you basically have to believe that they are totally incompetent. It's kind of like when Harry and Ron steal a car. Like, the excuse really is that they're 12 years old and they're just that stupid. They're stupid because it makes the story more interesting. That's the long and short of it. But again, looking at the Gorosei's conversation recently, another excuse sort of embedded in this is, that fruit is a legend even to us. It's as if Oda is trying to argue that the Gorosei have never cared about the fruit because, they haven't seen in their lifetime this fruit be anything more than basically a myth. I still have some questions as to why the quick heel turn. What about this battle with Kaido made them think that all of a sudden the impossible was possible? But at its heart, what this is an argument of incompetency. If they were too competent, frankly, it would ruin the story, given what we know now. Far from being wise and powerful like we like to believe the Gorosei to be, also with Imu here as well, unlike their predecessors who attempted to get the fruit, they have essentially failed. Basically, they're overconfident and lazy, willfully choosing to ignore the thing that will undo them. And this isn't without potentially getting into prophecy reasons why the world government should be devoting every resource possible to capture Straw Hat Luffy before he has the opportunity to become strong enough to defend himself. At this point, I feel like we know enough for it to be a legitimate fear that Joy Boy is going to return. And he's clearly tied to this fruit, which is personally how I interpret the Gorosei's rapid heel turn here and now. Like, they didn't think that he was going to awaken the fruit, but now he is, and probably Joy Boy has something to do with that. Their knowledge of the legend of Joy Boy and the prophecy of his return. Or maybe we should look at this a different way. The world government has been trying to obtain this double fruit for 800 years at least, and it has failed every single time. So maybe they've just given up, right? Like, no matter what they try to do, no matter the odds, no matter the circumstances, this fruit is just impossible for them to capture. So despite knowing that Luffy had the fruit, at this point in the story, they're like, it's not even worth trying. It is literally an impossible task. I actually think that this is probably the best excuse that Oda has, at least that I can think of right now. But you have to acknowledge the level of convolutedness that it takes in order to create this, as well as the fact that this is maybe not the most satisfying thing. It's one thing for Luffy to be nigh unkillable because of his determination, and it's another thing for a devil fruit to sort of possess these same attributes, essentially able to warp fate around itself. Low-key, I kind of wish this wasn't the case. Like, the world government had been able to capture the fruit before and had it under lock and key and thought that it was impossible to steal, but that happened anyway. For instance, when Rocks attacked Scott Valley, a place that you would think nobody is going to go there, lots of rare devil fruits probably there, you know, that sort of event, and then all of a sudden the Gomu Gomu no Mi is back on the market. But I just think that Oda ran into the problem, which is that, you know, if the fruit is this powerful and this notorious, then there's got to be a great reason why the world government hasn't done their utmost in order to get it back. And it is a problem not easily solved. And I think that this leads to the other side of the coin. And I think that this is a legitimate question. For how long had Oda planned for Luffy's fruit to be the strongest fruit? Some people are pulling up panels from chapter 1 in One Piece, and without getting into the details of it, I'm just going to say that in this case, I'm skeptical. Oda isn't human. Let's just be honest, right? The level of detail to which he's fleshed out his story and planned events in advance is unlike anything that I have seen. But we also know that not everything is planned in advance, and I think that this is a product of, being in the moment. Chapter by chapter, Oda has to entertain us, and that means that there's no way that every single idea has been totally fleshed out, nor, subject to change. I think that you see this the most when Oda plays with the community's expectation. Our expectations, whether we like it or not, impact the story. It's one thing to know where the story is going and then write it, but it is entirely different perspective to see people read it and the conclusions that they come to. Because those conclusions, whether we like it or not, influence what we would enjoy or not. Like, for instance, I think by this point in time, before Gear 4th, we really understood how the gears worked, or how Oda designed them. Gear 2nd, Luffy pumped his blood. Gear 3rd, he blew up his bones. Gear 4th, he blew up his muscles. So it has to do with Luffy manipulating his rubber body in some specific organ or structure within them. At this point, this idea is so pervasive, so universally accepted as being the realistic idea for how to create a Gear 5th, that it's almost like Oda can't choose that, like finding some way for Luffy's nerves to fire faster, as an example. I think that it's off the table because people sort of accept that as a baseline. Outside of the actual design of it, which could be very cool, people anticipate it, therefore the moment would be less impactful. But the truth is that could have been Oda's original plan. As he's designing Luffy's gears, he goes up to 5, and it's all just written out and beautiful for hundreds of chapters, and then he gets to Gear 4th, and then the community starts really catching on to where he's going, and then something's got to change. He's got to figure out what it is that we aren't expecting and how it is possible for him to get to that. I'm sure that Oda has always toyed with the idea that Luffy potentially has low-key the strongest fruit in the world because, it fits within the genre, right? It's just a thing that, as a trope, you can't ignore. As a tool in your story, you can't ignore. But how you go about getting to that moment can differ in many ways. And I really think that Oda hadn't quite yet decided to do this or not earlier on in the story, and that's where potential small issues arise. I felt this way about Haki as well. That is one of the ongoing debates that is going to greatly reflect, I think, what's going on here. Sometimes retcons are inevitable, for instance Crocodile. Did Crocodile have Haki in Alabasta? There is no freaking way. when Crocodile reappears in the story at some point in time, is he going to have Haki? You better believe it. I think that it's unfortunate, but it's also inevitable. To have a story that has been running concurrently for 25 years with very minimal few examples of this is a blessing beyond what words can describe. So you have just small things, right? And I want to focus very specifically on what Oda chose to do. This devil fruit is a mythical zone, model Nika. We heard the name Sun God Nika only 20 chapters ago. It could have been dropped from chapter 1 if Oda had fully fleshed out and decided exactly what he was going to do. It could have been very similar to Joy Boy. It would have spoiled nothing, would have revealed nothing. There's no context behind that name. There's no association necessarily with Luffy's devil fruit. So why didn't Oda foreshadow this heavily, or the name at least mention it? Make sure that people understood that, hey, I got this idea. You don't know what it is, but it's going to come up. The reason is because I don't think that he had evolved the idea to that point. Is it possible that Oda always intended for Luffy's fruit to be the strongest? You know what? I think that that's probably likely. But there's a huge difference between Luffy has low-key the strongest fruit, but nobody knows that. And Luffy alone is going to be the one to unlock its potential beyond what anybody has ever seen before. And versus what we actually got, which is that no, Luffy isn't going to be the one to fully unlock the fruit for the first time that nobody is anticipating. No, his fruit is actually legendary. Two ways in which Luffy has the strongest fruit, but very different. It may also be true that Oda wanted to associate Luffy's devil fruit with, like, spreading joy, with smiles. One of those interesting things that you can pick up now that could be foreshadowing is we see Luffy as a child. And Luffy as a child doesn't really embody the Luffy of the majority of the story in present day. As a kid, he's kind of whiny. He doesn't seem carefree. With what we got in this chapter, I think that it's fair to speculate and wonder, it may even be overt, that the devil fruit changed Luffy's nature. And the very first chapter, the chapter with Shanks, absolutely could be foreshadowing of this. And this could be part of Oda's original design, that he always intended for devil fruits to have an impact, influence those who ate them. As he says in this chapter, particularly zone types. But the actual way in which this manifests in the story, right, there's still ways in which Oda can be creative. I'm not convinced that from the very beginning of the story, Luffy's fruit was intended to be something other than the Gomu Gomu no Mi. I think that at this point, probably what I actually believe is that yes, Luffy ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi, and maybe it did change his nature and Oda intended to foreshadow it. That was the plan from the beginning. But I'm not sold that he intended for it to be a legendary fruit. I'm not sold that he intended for it to be a mythical zone of this particular model, with these particular powers. I think that those were creative choices that Oda has made relatively recently. And from this, I think that disappointment, or potential disappointment, is something that is justified and, almost inevitable, right? Like, every single one of Luffy's abilities, like Gomu Gomu no Mi is so classic. Gomu Gomu no, like, you're basically undoing all of that. Now, I don't think that those things are going to change, but I think that you have to believe that the decision to change Luffy's devil fruit was not one made easily. If it had been the plan from the start, I think that there would be more overt foreshadowing. But anyway, I just felt like these things needed to be said because this is going to be the heart of the discussion for the next forever. You may not want to hear it from me, but you're going to hear it from somebody if you're part of the community. And at the end of the day, I think, just the same as most things, you're probably just going to believe what it is that you want to believe. It comes down to whether or not you think that this moment was awesome. And full disclosure, I think that this moment was awesome. It always grinds my gears. It annoys me when people suggest that Oda has lost his passion, his drive for the series, that Oda doesn't care anymore. Like, how can you possibly come to that conclusion after reading a chapter like this? I really don't care if you disagree with the creative choices that Oda makes, but you have to acknowledge that those decisions, those choices are damn creative. Like, inside, this is difficult to explain, but inside I'm filled with so much hype. I see Luffy and I think, like, like a forest spirit. I've been playing Witcher somewhat recently, and like godlings, he's a mythical zone. It captures my imagination. I imagine him like the mischievous god spirit-like thing from mythology in a relatively niche form. Maybe like Mew from Pokemon or other legendary Pokemon like that, where he's playing jokes and smiling and having a good time, but also supremely powerful. And thinking about it that way makes everything that's happening so interesting. The pages in this chapter were just absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. Like, this is something that is not really appreciated unless you try to do it, but I would say the single thing which holds back most authors is creating a sense of realism in order to solve problems in interesting ways. Basically, you're limited, especially with a story that is this long, in the ways that you can write or draw things. The ways that you're capable of solving problems. Nearly every decision that you make limits which future decisions you can make. Or at the very least, that is normally true. Going back to Harry Potter, there's beauty in design. There's lots of creative moments in Harry Potter, and what allowed for that was magic. Basically, you design the world and you create the expectations that pretty much anything can happen, and you, by some means, somehow, instill that understanding in your audience, so that is the expectation. The design gives you freedom to just do things. And I think that you can see how this applies to One Piece, particularly with the powers that we got in this chapter. In all of his interviews and things of that nature, I think that you get a better sense that, and I think that he's even outright stated this, like, the story, writing the story, coming up with the plot of the story is not Oda's favorite thing to do. That is not what he looks forward to. At his heart, what Oda enjoys is drawing, which makes a lot of sense given manga. But with the story that is, again, continuous for 25 years, finding new things to draw or drawing things in new ways becomes an increasingly difficult problem. For all those out there that are worried about Oda losing passion, I think that lacking new, creative, interesting things to draw would be the number one reason why that ever happened. And with this chapter, Oda ensures that it likely will never. Because kind of like Harry Potter, Luffy's Awakening Gear 5th, I think that Oda can practically do whatever it is that he wants to. I know there's still some limits, but the number of shackles to Luffy's powers in the story are significantly less. Oda has literally used Awakening to awaken the story itself, in my opinion. Specifically regarding Luffy, the main character, who would have the most fights, the most screen time. It kind of limits the amount of pressure Oda would face in order to basically make new characters' abilities be the thing which really captures our imagination. Luffy can now do that by himself. And despite what some people may say, this I think has been a problem for the story for a while now. He designed the Gomu Gomu no Mi from very early on in the story to be very flexible. Aha! But of course there's limits, and eventually you reach them. The point at which you have stretched Luffy's powers as they are, without adding new things as far as it can go. So once you reach this point where base Luffy isn't enough, then you have forms, right? Luffy's new forms. You need a new forms in order to do new things with the Devil Fruit. But we kind of reached that point too. Then Oda adds new powers, things that Luffy can learn, not necessarily related to his Devil Fruit, like Haki. But we did that too. I think that this as a concept has diminishing returns. Like every time that you want to do something, you have to introduce a new form or a new, poorly fleshed out power, right? Like the more of these that you have, you run into like a Dragon Ball syndrome. At first, base Goku was enough, then it was Kaioken, then it was Super Saiyan, then it was Super Saiyan 2, or, Ascended, or 3, and then, you know what I say, Fusion. For me personally, as I'm watching the show, every time there's something new, it's like, I liked Super Saiyan, the original one, the best, or Kaioken. I understand why the story needs these things, but the first one was the best. I think that there comes a point where stories like this, shonen like that, could really use a wand. The wand, starting from the very beginning of the story, is capable of doing whatever it is that you need it to do. There is really no finite limit. And while the Gomu Gomu no Mi was designed to be similar, there is a finite limit. And so I think that with this awakening, it's really the best attempt that Oda has done up until this point to sort of reset the story so that we're back in chapter 1 with a devil fruit that is capable and flexible enough to do a lot of new things without a million new forms. And again, just full disclosure, I am ready for the story to focus again on devil fruits. I'm tired of hockey. Hockey was cool as an idea for a short period of time, but it is not a flexible enough power. There's some interesting things you can do visually, but it's not the same as the devil fruit. The devil fruit from the very beginning was always the superior thing. Oda just needed a way in which to hurt Logia. He created a problem for himself and he got himself out of the problem. But I think that we focused too much on hockey, and the story always was better when devil fruits were the emphasis. And I feel like this turns the page back to where we needed to be. This has me so excited for the entire catalog of devil fruits. Luffy didn't know what his devil fruit was. How many others, have an ability but haven't awakened it and don't know what it really can do? The first name that comes to mind is Blackbeard. The Gorosei talk about how the fruit has a will of its own and it can't be captured. Blackbeard said something similarly about the Yami Yami no Mi, how the fruit chose him. He also mentioned how it was kind of a Logia, but it was also very weird. If you're looking for more sort of excuses that are foreshadowing that Oda had intended for devil fruits to do something like we saw today, Blackbeard would be a great one too. I think that it is pretty likely that the Yami Yami no Mi is not a pseudo-Logia. It is a mythical zone, probably awakened, going to do something like Luffy's. The thought fills me with immeasurable hype I cannot explain. But if Oda wants to, he can throw something similar like this, maybe not at Luffy's level, maybe the devil fruits aren't quite as strong as Luffy's, but he can do it again. Katakuri, special paramecia. What does that mean? I'm even thinking about Kondro, right? Like Kondro can draw things, but we see him in this chapter like his spirit is entombed within the little ink thing, and I just like how cool would it be if Kondro's fruit was actually a zone, an ink god, and what we're actually seeing is his awakened form, capable of transforming himself into whatever it is that he can imagine. I'm not saying it's true, but the thought is just insanely cool. And we're also back on the tracks of the lore of devil fruit themselves. We can't talk about this enough, right? Like, the Gorosei basically said that zone devil fruits in particular have their own will. I think it supports the idea that we've been talking about in recent weeks of the devil within the devil fruit. What determines these fruits' will? What it is that they do, who they choose? Before becoming devil fruits or spirits within devil fruits, were they real people with agendas? But at the same time, we have new wrinkles to chew over. Like the thought that I'd like to believe before is that Joy Boy was a person from the Void Century that is imprisoned within this Nika fruit. But now it's like, okay, well, we know that this fruit has awakened before, and it was likely done during the Void Century. So Joy Boy probably ate this specific devil fruit and was the last person to awaken it. But that means that he first ate the devil fruit. So the devil fruit might even be even more ancient than him. It's really like saying that the person from the Void Century wasn't Joy Boy, but that this fruit all along is Joy Boy. The person who awakens the fruit becomes Joy Boy. It's very fitting given the fruit. But given that I want to believe that the devil fruit has some kind of will, and that will stems from something, maybe at some point they were a person that became a fruit, then the conflict is even more ancient than we realize. It's like all this stems from the Void Century, right? It's like, how many Void Centuries has there been? Are we on like Void Century number 3? Now, pretty much. The chapter creates that thought in my mind. Like, it's more than just history repeating itself. It's that history has always repeated itself. The cyclical cycle isn't just, we're not just entering the end of the loop, but there's been multiple. And it's this fruit, the power of Joy Boy, which is the harbinger of transformation, the chaotic force which upends the established order. But anyway, there's so many little things from this chapter that I feel like are noteworthy. Like, for instance, Luffy's appearance. I mean, his eyebrows are curled in the shape of spirals like Sanji. Also, like many people from Wano, like if you look at Grandpa Hyo and you look at Luffy, there's some similarities there. And I've wondered for the longest time, like, what is up with these people, their appearances in Wano? Is there some mythical blood in them? Is there a connection that hasn't yet been revealed? Like, here's a question for you. Are devil fruits based on things that really existed? Like, is the sun god Nika a thing that either exists or once existed? Like a real one, not just somebody who ate a fruit which mimics it. Are we actually seeing the form of a god? Like One Piece lore. Another thing that is really interesting, is probably going to spark a lot of discussion, is how much of this is Luffy and how much of this is the fruit? And do you guys like that or not? This feels like a thing that is mostly taste, right? Whether you think that it fits in with the themes of the story or not. But I mean, we're sitting here and I have to think that the devil fruit's nature has definitely changed Luffy. Seems strikingly obvious now as he's laughing during the fight, totally carefree, like it's like a drug. Totally changed his mood. Speaking of connections, how does this connect to Smile? Because honestly, right now, I mean, Luffy is acting a lot like Pleasures. There's a fair argument, I think, that this story is no longer about Luffy. As crazy it is to say, it's not about Luffy. This is a story about the Gomu Gomu no Mi. The Gomu Gomu no Mi, or the Nika fruit, is the hero. And I think that it goes without saying that a lot of people could have huge problems with this. A lot of stories, it's about interpreting the themes. Like, there's actual themes in the story, but how you read it obviously matters most. And, it's like, the boy who is a particular way is going to save the world with his will and determination. And now, I think that some reevaluation is necessary. I think that a lot of people found value in Luffy being a human, maybe the chosen one, but the particular kind of human necessary to change the world. But now he seems far less human, far less in control. He's almost like a puppet for the fruit and the whims of fate and the universe. So how Oda goes about describing this and using this, I think requires some very careful consideration. Personally, I would like a little bit of backtracking. Not all of this is backtracking, but a little bit to make Luffy again sort of the central figure that made all of this possible. Like, for instance, yes, the devil fruit has some influence on Luffy, but very minimal. And that awakening the fruit is a Luffy feat, and not simply the will of the devil fruit. The devil is not controlling or overtly influencing Luffy, but merely chose him because of who he is. I much prefer that, and something I always kind of assumed anyway, because of what Blackbeard said. And all of this leads down a very interesting rabbit hole that, again, I'm not envious that I have to navigate this, but, it's like, well, the devil fruits get to choose, basically, right? Their will has an impact. The government tries to take the fruit, but they simply can't. It almost makes devil fruits gods in and of themselves. The devil fruits secretly control the world. They're fighting against one another to create a world in an image that they prefer. You have the Gomu Gomu god fruit, which is a very different kind of god than the Yami Yami god fruit. And these two are secretly scheming against one another in order to create a world that they want. It sounds ridiculous, but it's a thought that can be created. It's like in this weird space of being simultaneously hype beyond belief and also scary. I feel like the world of One Piece just became ancient Greece or Rome. You know what I mean? Where it's like, well, we're just kind of existing and we're at the whims of the gods who are constantly bickering and fighting with each other and doing whatever the hell they do. For whatever the hell reason they do it. We're just subject to their whims. I haven't even talked about Orochi really at all. I think that a lot of that was really good. When Hiyori cried, I really felt that. But also it was probably as expected, far less crazy as everything else. Although Hiyori's line about the Kozuki, they always stay true to their promises, reminds you of Joy Boy, his promise to Fishman Island. And then there was Kanjuro's betrayal of Orochi. Guys, when I read the chapter, I did not understand what the hell was going on, like straight up. And in some respects, I feel like Oda dropped the ball a little bit without being more explicit because, I pay attention, maybe not more than everyone else, but more than your average fan. And if I'm reading a chapter in a moment and I don't know what the hell is going on or why something is occurring, it's probably a little bit of dropping the ball unless Oda plans to delve into this more later. But my theory is, and this makes a lot of sense to me once I sort of take a moment and be like, okay, this happened, why did it happen? When Orochi originally recruited Kanjuro, he gave Kanjuro an order. He said, live as a Kozuki until you die. Or here, let's read it. You will live your life as a true Kozuki, and ultimately without a single soul noticing, you will die as a Kozuki. Kanjuro is a really weird character, but he likes to play a role and is obedient to Orochi's direction in this regard. So in this moment, he is literally dying, and he is dying as a true Kozuki, getting revenge on Orochi. And that leads into Hiyori's line about, Kozuki always keeps their promises. Kanjuro is keeping his promise. If this is the truth, I feel like once you understand, it is an incredibly beautiful moment. But if I have to go back and read it in order to understand, a lot of people aren't going to do that watching. Maybe it'll be more clear in the anime for more of those casuals, but I really wish that Oda had been a little bit more explicit. A flashback, a tiny flashback, would have sufficed, I think. But anyway, once you sort of overcome what happened in the chapter itself, then apply it to what will happen. Luffy is like a godlike entity. Again, we think, okay, well, Kaido's defeat is inevitable, but how does this tie in with everything else and the island? I feel like Luffy can just save everyone now if he really wanted to, or seems to be a reasonable thought. Another question is, how powerful is Luffy now? Because, he basically almost died, but now he is resurrected from the dead, even more powerful than before. Can he even be defeated? I don't know. What are the limitations to awakening? What are the rules of awakening? Questions. But what about the government's attempt on Wano, the reveals about Joy Boy that seem very much incoming, things with Momonosuke, the wishes, the wills of people, the fire festival. This was already so much, and then now it's like, okay, I feel like things have changed. They may not have, but I feel that way. I'm even more hyped as well for events after Wano because, this clearly ties into One Piece lore about what will occur in the future. Luffy is now Joy Boy, so that will definitely encourage the world government to act, probably very drastically. The world is about, was already established, right? That if Luffy won, the world would be turned upside down, the Yonkos and such, but it is even more clear that that is going to happen. And Luffy will be at the center of it. I'm just losing my freaking mind. Anyway, we're at 43 minutes, so I think that it is time to end this review. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video, subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.